Growing up in England as a writer, and I was a writer from as far back as I can remember, scribbling little bits of poetry when I was 6 or 7. But as an English would-be writer, Paris always seemed the goal, the exotic but exciting and real place to be. I didn't go there until I was about 21 or 22, I think, 21, when I just got married, and we went over there for a sort of honeymoon, and I didn't know very much about Paris, and my French was the worst of schoolboy French. But nevertheless, I got excited by the place, as lots of people do. And since then I've been back many, many times, usually not staying for long. 6 months, I think, was the longest I ever stayed there. But I began to feel the place, feel in tune with the place. And like most people do, I didn't want to be mistaken for a tourist, so I adopted Parisian walks and Parisian looks. And then, after many visits, I got stuck for a long time in Australia, and I became out of work and not too well, and my spirits sank lower and lower. And every year I'd make a proposal to the Australian Literature Board that could I have a trip to Paris, please. They did a sort of scholarship thing with accommodation in Paris, and every year I got knocked back. And finally, at my lowest, and I was living with a young woman in a very remote spot in a tin shed virtually, and she decided that after all it was time for her to move on and take a job somewhere else. And I thought, well, how much lower can I go? And a letter arrived, and I opened it, and it said I had been awarded 6 months in Paris, fares paid, money to spend. Wonderful. Just what I needed. So I went over there and stayed in the Cité Internationale des Arts, which is right on the banks of the Seine, and out the studio windows you can see the Notre Dame Cathedral, and an absolute lovely spot to stay. Really the south edge of Le Marais. And there were about 300 studios there, and they were occupied by artists of various kinds from all over the world. And the whole thing was run so nicely and so well, and I realised that no one in Australia had ever written a book about the place. There didn't seem to be a book about the place. So, great. I would write one, and then the idea came to me, well, I'd make a collection of all the Australian writers who had stayed in that studio. And after a lot of trouble, I began to get these writers to send me bits and pieces. I was a bit lost for a cover, and then I ran into a bloke one day, and someone said, oh, he's a famous Australian artist. I'd never heard of him. Anyway, I thought, I wonder if I could get him to do a cover. And so we got chatting, and I went up to his little studio, which was much the same as mine. I said, have you got any examples of your work? And he produced a portfolio. Beautiful stuff, beautiful stuff. So I then found out that he was, in actual fact, a very well-known painter in Australia, and commanded great sums of money for his canvases. And so I thought, well, that sort of ruins that. But I'd started discussing it with him, and we came to a wonderful deal where he would do the cover and some inside illustrations. So I got it all together, and that turned into a book which we called Paris Studio, which is a pretty inspired title again. I'm good with my titles. And some of the writers that are in the book were or have become pretty good international writers. There's bits of poetry, there's short stories, And I wrote linking pieces between each of the contributors, and I wrote them in they're almost short stories on their own, but it's about me and the women I met in Paris. My first wife was the first woman I took there, and sort of on our honeymoon, and she went home on her own, which was the first. And I had so many disasters with women in Paris, and there was a time when I thought, well, I must never have anything to do with a woman there again. But then, in later visits, I had some wonderful things happen. I got to know a woman doctor who stopped being a doctor and had become an excellent artist, painter. And she knew everyone in the hospitals there, so when I was sick she could get me straight in and seen to. I got to know a young photographer there, and I'd go around with her and she'd be doing portraits of artists. And then I met a very interesting guy, a sculptor, Gerard Ramon, and became welcome at his studio and home in Montparnasse. And through him I met a female sculptor, excellent stuff. And so now when I go to Paris, it's a whole different world. I know where I'm going to stay, I know how to use the buses, I know, I've always got friends all over the place, and this is really the only way to get the feel of a city, is to have good established friends there.